I am swirling a glass of Cabernet in my Manhattan penthouse, watching the digital clock inch toward midnight on day 14. My husband thinks he won. 2 weeks ago, he walked through our mahogany front doors with his 24-year-old mistress and introduced her as our new live-in nanny. He stood in the center of the home I paid for, adjusted his tailored suit vest, and looked me dead in the eye. He blamed my demanding career for neglecting our 4-year-old son, using my 60-hour work weeks as the perfect excuse to move his girlfriend into my guest suite. He told me I was failing as a mother and that she was here to fix our family. He expected me to cry. He expected me to shatter under the weight of his cruel manipulation. Instead, I smiled, welcomed her inside, and handed her the household employment paperwork to sign. She was so blinded by her own greed and the thrill of stealing my life that she failed to read a single line of the fine print. She had no idea she had just signed a lethal resignation and vacate form that would soon strip her of everything. Before I share the exact moment this 14-day countdown detonated their lives, welcome to Samantha Told Stories. Let me know your age and where you are listening from in the comments below, and hit that subscribe button if you have ever had to outsmart someone who mistook your kindness for weakness. Now let me tell you how my husband's arrogance became his executioner. My name is Mallory Brooks. I'm 36 years old, and I work as the Vice President of Corporate Crisis Management for a top-tier public relations firm in New York City. I dismantle high-stakes disasters for a living. I step into boardrooms where fortunes are burning, assess the damage, identify the liabilities, and neutralize the threat. My reputation is built on freezing my nervous system when everyone else is panicking. But nothing prepared me for the Tuesday afternoon the disaster walked directly into my own foyer. The heavy mahogany doors swung open with a soft click. Nathan, my husband of 7 years, strode in. At 39, he is a venture capitalist who curates his image down to the thread count of his shirts. He prides himself on being the smartest man in the room, constantly chasing the next big acquisition. Trailing a few steps behind him was Kinsley. She held a canvas tote bag and wore wide, innocent eyes that did not match the smug tilt of her chin. Nathan dropped his leather briefcase onto the entryway console. He did not ease into the conversation. He delivered a rehearsed speech pitching this domestic arrangement like a new startup investment. Leo needed more structure, he said. My late nights at the agency were creating a void in our household. Kinsley, a former barista he claimed to have met through a colleague, was highly recommended for live-in childcare. He leaned forward to kiss my cheek, a performative gesture meant to project husbandly support. That was when the scent hit my senses. A distinct, heavy wave of bergamot and cheap vanilla. My breath caught in my throat. My pulse thrummed against my ears, drowning out the ambient hum of the city traffic below our windows. It was the exact perfume I had washed out of his shirt collar 3 nights prior. I looked past his shoulder. Kinsley stood there, offering a tight, overly sweet smile. Her gaze darted around the vaulted ceilings, the original contemporary artwork, the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson River. I watched her eyes widen as she took in the sweeping views and the imported Italian furniture. She was taking inventory of her new kingdom, mentally replacing my presence with her own. An ordinary woman would have thrown the crystal vase resting on the table. She would have screamed, demanded a divorce, and called an attorney right there on the spot. But I am not an ordinary woman, and my career relies on emotional detachment. I compartmentalized the betrayal instantly, locking the devastation behind a mental steel vault. Panic is sloppy. Emotion is a liability. If I confronted him now, he would spin the narrative, gaslight me, and hide his assets. I needed him to feel secure. I stepped forward and extended my hand. I told Kinsley we were so grateful for the help. Her grip was limp, her skin cool. She blinked, clearly surprised that I was not putting up a fight. Nathan let out a long exhale, rolling his shoulders back, convinced his master stroke had landed perfectly. He truly believed he had outsmarted me, assuming my exhaustion from work made me blind to his deception. The first skirmish happened within 5 minutes. While Nathan stepped onto the terrace to take a phone call, Kinsley approached the marble entryway table. Without asking, she slid my curated silver catch-all tray a few inches to the left, making room for her oversized sunglasses and a tube of lip gloss. It was a subtle, silent assertion of territory, a test to see what I would tolerate in my own home. I did not correct her. I played the distracted, exhausted executive to perfection. I offered to show her the guest suite, chatting breezily about the household routine, the organic grocery deliveries, and Leo's preschool schedule. I watched her run her fingers along the custom wainscoting in the hallway, a faint smirk playing on her lips. She thought I was a pathetic, overworked wife paying for the privilege of being replaced. As we walked down the corridor, I paused by the hallway thermostat. I casually tapped the glass screen, keeping my tone light and conversational. I mentioned that we were upgrading the smart home network later this week, installing a few new sensors to monitor Leo's screen time. I told her not to mind the technicians if she saw them around the penthouse checking the wiring. Kinsley nodded, her focus already drifting to the plush carpeting and the expensive fixtures in her new bedroom. Neither she nor Nathan paid any attention to the digital infrastructure wrapping around them. They were too drunk on their own cleverness, too consumed by the thrill of conducting an affair right under my nose. They assumed technology was just another luxury convenience, failing to realize it was the very surveillance net I would use to capture their ruin. I left her in the guest suite to unpack her designer luggage I recognized from a recent charge on our joint credit card statement that Nathan had claimed was a corporate gift for a client. The puzzle pieces were snapping together with terrifying clarity. I walked back toward the kitchen, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors. They believed they had successfully smuggled a Trojan horse into my sanctuary. They thought I was a naive workaholic, too busy putting out fires for my clients to notice the smoke in my own home. But as I poured myself a glass of cold water, the chill in my veins solidified into pure resolve. The countdown clock had officially started ticking. They had no idea they had just invited an apex predator into their delusion, and I was going to let them build their fragile glass house, just so I could enjoy the sound it made when I shattered it. The next morning, crisp autumn sunlight sliced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our kitchen, casting long, sharp shadows across the Calacatta marble island. The air smelled of freshly ground espresso beans and the faint, lingering trace of that cheap vanilla perfume. I stood by the sleek coffee machine, wearing a tailored navy blazer projecting the calm, collected aura of a woman preparing for another demanding day at the agency. I was the picture of the oblivious, dedicated professional. Nathan sat on a leather bar stool typing an email on his phone. He looked up, offering me a brilliant, flawless smile. It was the smile of a man who believed he had successfully orchestrated the ultimate deception. He truly thought he had engineered a pristine system where his loyal wife managed his household while his young mistress slept securely down the hall. His ego was a fragile, inflated balloon, and I was holding the needle behind my back. Kinsley drifted into the kitchen a few moments later. She was wearing a plush cashmere robe. It was my spare cashmere robe, pulled straight from the guest suite closet. She tied the belt tightly around her waist, gliding across the hardwood floors, acting as though she had owned this penthouse for years. She walked over to my son Leo, who was quietly eating a bowl of oatmeal at the breakfast nook. She patted his shoulder with a stiff, rehearsed gesture of maternal affection. Leo barely looked up, his small hands continuing to play with his spoon, instinctively sensing the unnatural, forced energy she brought into his space. I did not flinch at the sight of her wearing my clothing. I turned around and placed a thick, cream-colored manila folder onto the marble counter. The heavy, authoritative thud of the paper hitting the stone drew both of their attention. I kept my voice light, casual, and steeped in corporate pragmatism. I looked directly at Nathan and explained that keeping our household administration spotless was a top priority. I reminded him that his venture capital firm thrived on a pristine public reputation, and any hint of improper domestic employment or tax evasion would trigger an instant board review. Therefore, I told him I had routed Kinsley's employment contract through my public relations firm's elite domestic staffing accountant. This ensured full compliance with state labor laws and insulated his professional profile from any unwanted IRS scrutiny. Nathan nodded slowly, his chest puffing out slightly. His narcissism demanded total financial insulation, and he loved nothing more than when I used my resources to protect his image. He praised my efficiency, calling me the most organized woman he had ever met. He had no idea that my administrative prowess was currently building a lethal trap right in front of his eyes. I slid the thick folder across the smooth marble toward Kinsley. I told her that to process her weekly salary, our accountant required standard onboarding documents, W-2 forms, direct deposit authorizations, and a standard background check waiver. Then I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a slender, black velvet box. I popped the lid open, revealing a heavy, rose gold designer fountain pen. The polished metal gleamed under the kitchen pendant lights. I offered it to Kinsley with a warm, welcoming smile. I told her it was a small gift, a token of appreciation to welcome her to the family. Her eyes lit up at the sight of the designer emblem etched into the cap. The sheer greed radiating from her face was palpable. She eagerly took the pen, testing its heavy, balanced weight in her hand. She felt important. She felt elevated. She felt like she was stepping into a life of untold luxury. She opened the folder and uncapped the pen. She did not read the cover page. She did not scan the table of contents. Blinded by the thrill of stealing my life and eager to secure her place in this multi-million-dollar apartment, she simply looked for the yellow sticky notes indicating where to sign. Nestled quietly beneath the generic tax forms and the direct deposit slips was a highly customized, legally lethal document. It was a formal resignation, vacate, and forfeiture agreement. In the state of New York, tenant rights are notoriously difficult to navigate. If a person resides in a home for 30 days, they can establish legal residency, requiring a grueling, months-long court eviction process to remove them. I knew that if Kinsley stayed past that 30-day mark, extracting her would become a public, messy, and drawn-out legal battle. To circumvent this, the contract she was currently signing featured a strict 14-day probationary clause. By placing her signature on that specific dotted line, she was explicitly waiving all standard New York tenant protections. She was legally acknowledging that her housing was strictly tied to her employment status, and upon termination, she agreed to immediate, uncontested eviction. The sound of the gold nib scratching against the thick paper filled the quiet kitchen. Each looping cursive signature was the sound of a lock snapping shut. But the trap went much deeper than a simple eviction notice. Buried on page 7 was an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. This clause stipulated that any violation of household confidentiality or any attempt to disparage our family in the press or online would result in crushing financial penalties. She was legally gagging herself. She was giving me the unilateral authority to bankrupt her the moment she stepped out of line. She flipped to the final page, oblivious to the fact that she was signing away her entire future. She capped the designer pen, running her thumb proudly over the rose gold finish, and handed the folder back to me. She smiled a triumphant, secretive little smirk meant only for herself. She truly believed she was untouchable. I took the folder, feeling the satisfying weight of her legal surrender in my hands. I slid the documents safely into my leather briefcase. Kinsley turned her attention to the coffee station. Instead of reaching for the generic ceramic mugs designated for guests, she reached to the very back of the shelf. She pulled out my specific, hand-painted ceramic mug, a unique piece I had purchased during a solo trip to Italy years ago. It was a deliberate, calculated microaggression. She poured the dark roast coffee, added a splash of oat milk, and leaned against the marble counter. She brought my favorite mug to her lips and took a slow sip, locking her gaze with mine over the rim. The challenge in her eyes was unmistakable. She was testing the boundaries, seeing how much of my territory she could claim before I broke. I did not break. I did not scowl. I simply smiled back at her, radiating a serene, untouchable calm. Let her drink from my cup. Let her wear my spare robe. Let her sleep in my guest bed. She was living on borrowed time, a squatter residing inside a ticking legal time bomb. I held the detonator in my briefcase, and the 14-day countdown had officially begun. Nathan finished his espresso, placing his cup in the sink. He checked his luxury watch and announced he had an early meeting at his venture capital firm. Before heading toward the private elevator, he paused and looked between Kinsley and me. He casually mentioned that his mother Patricia was coming over for Sunday brunch tomorrow. He wanted her to meet our wonderful new nanny and see how well the new household dynamic was functioning. My serene smile remained perfectly fixed, but a new, sharper current of tension crackled through my veins. Patricia was a hypercritical, elitist woman who had never hidden her disdain for my financial independence. If Nathan was bringing her into this dynamic, the battlefield was about to expand. The domestic war was no longer just between a betrayed wife and a naive mistress. The true hostile takeover was just beginning. Sunday morning brought a different kind of storm into the penthouse. The private elevator chimed at precisely 11 o'clock, and the polished steel doors parted to reveal Patricia Brooks. Nathan's mother was a woman carved from old Manhattan wealth, draped in a tailored tweed suit and a string of pearls that cost more than my entire college education. Patricia had always viewed my professional ambition not as an achievement, but as a direct insult to her son. In her world, a wife existed to manage the social calendar, host charity galas, and elevate her husband's status. A woman who earned her own 7-figure salary and negotiated corporate mergers was a threat to the natural order. Nathan greeted her with a warm embrace, taking her cashmere coat. I stepped forward, offering a polite smile and a brief hug that felt like embracing a marble statue. Patricia offered a tight, closed-lip smile in return, her sharp gaze immediately scanning the foyer for any sign of domestic failure. Then Kinsley walked into the room. She was holding a silver tray of fresh pastries, playing the role of the dutiful, radiant caregiver. Patricia's demeanor shifted instantly. The frost melted into a performance of overwhelming warmth. She reached out, grasping Kinsley by the hands, cooing over her youthful energy and her supposed natural grace. During our catered brunch on the terrace, the real psychological warfare commenced. We sat around the glass dining table, the city skyline stretching out beneath us, while Patricia orchestrated a masterclass in passive hostility. She took a sip of her mimosa, looking pointedly at Leo, who was happily eating a croissant next to Kinsley. Patricia sighed, placing her crystal glass down with a delicate clink. She remarked how wonderful it was that Leo finally had a consistent, nurturing presence in his life. She looked directly into my eyes, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. She said she could not imagine the toll my grueling corporate schedule took on a growing boy. She added that a child needs a mother figure who is actually present, not one who is always chained to a smartphone handling other people's crises. Kinsley soaked up the praise like a sponge. She offered a modest, self-deprecating laugh, placing a gentle hand on Nathan's arm. She told Patricia that she was just happy to help create a warm, traditional home environment for the family. Nathan beamed, his chest swelling with pride as the two women in his life validated his toxic choices. I cut a piece of smoked salmon, keeping my expression entirely serene. I did not defend my career. I did not point out that my salary funded this very penthouse, or that my health insurance covered Patricia's recent elective surgeries. I simply nodded, thanking Kinsley for her dedication. I let them believe they were winning the social game, serving them more champagne while they celebrated my supposed replacement. When brunch concluded, Patricia asked Kinsley to show her the guest suite, claiming she wanted to see how the new nanny was settling in. Nathan retreated to the living room to watch the financial news networks. This was the opening I needed. I walked into the kitchen, pretending to clear the silver serving trays. I set them down silently, pulled my smartphone from my blazer pocket, and opened the newly installed smart home application. I tapped the icon for the guest suite, activating the hidden high-definition camera I had integrated into the ceiling smoke detector 2 days prior. The screen flickered to life, offering a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of the bedroom. I raised the volume on my earpiece. The audio feed was flawless. Patricia was sitting on the edge of the velvet armchair, while Kinsley stood by the closet. The artificial warmth had vanished from the older woman's face, replaced by a calculating, razor-sharp intensity. Patricia did not just know about the affair. She had actively endorsed it. I listened, my blood turning to ice, as Patricia instructed the 24-year-old on how to systematically dismantle my life. Her voice was low, urgent, and steeped in venom. She told Kinsley to start keeping a detailed, handwritten ledger of every single night I worked past 6 o'clock. She ordered her to document every missed bedtime, every interrupted weekend meal, and every time I took a business call around Leo. Patricia was coaching her on how to build a paper trail of maternal neglect. The end game was not just replacing me in Nathan's bed. Patricia wanted total control of the Brooks family wealth. She explained to Kinsley that New York courts favored the primary caregiver. If they could frame me as an unfit absentee mother, Nathan could secure full custody of Leo. More importantly, securing full custody meant Nathan could leverage a massive advantage in the divorce settlement, stripping me of my assets and ensuring he kept his venture capital fortune intact. Kinsley nodded eagerly, her greed blinding her to the reality of the older woman's manipulation. She promised Patricia she would start the journal tonight. I stood in the kitchen, gripping the edge of the marble counter so hard my knuckles turned white. A profound, searing rage ignited in my chest. They were not just trying to steal my husband. They were trying to take my son. They were conspiring to tear my child away from me to protect a venture capitalist's bank account. The grief of a broken marriage evaporated instantly. It was burned away by the cold, unyielding clarity of a mother preparing for war. I knew that if I reacted now, if I marched down the hallway and confronted them with the recording, they would deny it. Nathan would hire elite litigators, claim the surveillance was an illegal invasion of privacy, and use my emotional outburst as the very proof of instability they were looking for. I needed to blind them. I needed a distraction so grand, so overwhelming, that they would never notice the trap closing around them. I closed the security application and initiated a secure, encrypted backup of the video file, routing it to an offshore cloud server beyond Nathan's reach. Then, I set my red herring into motion. I walked into my home office and pulled out a thick stack of glossy event brochures I had collected earlier that week. I carried them into the dining room, spreading them across the grand mahogany table. I pulled out my laptop, a legal pad, and several swatches of expensive fabric. When Patricia and Kinsley finally emerged from the hallway, I was frantically scribbling notes, looking like a woman on the edge of a nervous breakdown. Nathan walked in, pausing at the sight of the chaos. I looked up, offering a frantic, stressed smile. I confess that I was overwhelmed trying to plan his upcoming 40th surprise birthday gala. I pointed to the brochures showing him mock-ups of a rented luxury yacht on the Hudson River, imported beluga caviar menus, and contracts for a live string quartet. I babbled about guest lists and bespoke ice sculptures projecting the exact image of a desperate, insecure wife trying to buy her husband's affection with an exorbitant display of wealth. Nathan's ego devoured the performance. His eyes lit up at the mention of the yacht and the caviar. He looked at Kinsley, sharing a brief, mocking smirk. They saw exactly what they wanted to see. A pathetic, clueless woman, pouring her energy into a meaningless party, entirely blind to the betrayal happening under her own roof. Patricia offered a condescending pat on my shoulder, telling me not to stress too much about the details, assuring me that the effort was what mattered. She gathered her coat and left the penthouse, convinced her sinister custody plot was safe. Nathan and Kinsley retreated to the living room, pouring themselves fresh drinks, whispering and laughing, thoroughly entertained by my supposed desperation. Their guard was entirely lowered. They believed I was consumed by seating charts and catering contracts. This diversion gave me the ultimate cover. I gathered my fake party planning materials and announced I needed to retreat to my home office to finalize the deposit for the string quartet. I asked them not to disturb me for the rest of the afternoon. Nathan waved me off, already pulling Kinsley closer on the sofa. I walked into my office, shut the heavy oak door, and locked the deadbolt. The frantic, stressed facade vanished from my face the moment the lock clicked into place. I set the party brochures neatly into the recycling bin. I turned my attention to the sleek oak desk in the center of the room. Resting near the corner, carelessly left behind in his arrogant haste, was Nathan's personal laptop. He thought his secrets were safe because he used biometric fingerprint locks and complex passwords. He forgot that I was the one who had configured our original home network. He forgot who he was dealing with. I sat down in the leather executive chair, opened the silver lid, and prepared to dissect his entire financial existence. The heavy oak door of my home office provided a thick acoustic barrier against the faint sounds of laughter drifting from the living room. Nathan and his mistress were out there pouring expensive wine, likely mocking my frantic dedication to a phantom birthday gala. Inside the room, the atmosphere was entirely different. The air was cool and still smelling faintly of leather and lemon polish. I sat in my ergonomic executive chair, staring at the sleek silver casing of his personal laptop resting on the desk. My husband was a man who traded millions in early-stage tech investments, frequently boasting about elite cybersecurity protocols to his prestigious clients. At home, however, his arrogance bred unforgivable laziness. He relied on a simple 6-digit passcode for his personal machine. It was the date of his first major corporate acquisition. I typed the numbers. The screen glowed to life, illuminating the dark room with a harsh blue light. My pulse remained steady, my breathing slow and controlled. I did not open his personal messaging applications or search for sordid photographs hidden in encrypted folders. Infidelity was a boring, predictable cliché, a symptom of a much larger disease. I was hunting for the structural blueprints of his deception. I opened his financial management software, bypassing the secondary verification prompt by routing the access code to the backup email address I had configured for him 3 years ago. He was brilliant at pitching startups, but he lacked the patience for digital housekeeping. The dashboard loaded, displaying an intricate network of checking accounts, stock portfolios, and offshore holdings. I navigated directly to our joint high-yield savings ledger. This specific fund was sacred ground. We established it the week Leo was born, intending it to serve as a fortress for his future, covering private academy tuition and eventual university expenses. I had personally deposited my annual executive bonuses into this account for years, prioritizing our son over luxury cars or designer wardrobes. I clicked the transaction history. The available balance read $412. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. The ambient hum of the central air conditioning seemed to vanish. My eyes traced the digital log, landing on a single, staggering outbound wire transfer initiated 10 days ago. $250,000 had vanished in one keystroke. I highlighted the routing number, opening a secure background tracing tool I utilized for corporate risk assessment at my public relations agency. The digital breadcrumbs led away from the Manhattan banking infrastructure, crossing state lines, into a notorious corporate tax haven. The funds had settled into a newly minted shell company, registered in Delaware. The entity name glowed on my screen, spelling out Kinsley Lifestyle, LLC, in stark, unforgiving text. The betrayal metastasized, spreading from my marriage into my motherhood. He had not just brought a former barista into my home to parade her around in my clothes. He was funding a boutique fashion brand for a 24-year-old, using my child's education trust. The theft of Leo's future was a profound stab in the back. But my crisis management instincts warned me that Nathan was far too ambitious to stop at a mere $250,000. Venture capitalists of his caliber did not launch shell companies using only personal savings. They leveraged other people's money. I dug deeper, accessing the secure portal he used for his investment firm. I needed to see the operating agreement for this new lifestyle brand. How was an unknown entity with zero revenue securing premium manufacturing contracts and banking privileges? I found a compressed folder labeled Guarantor Agreements and opened the primary document. The breath left my lungs entirely. My vision narrowed to a single, terrifying line of black ink at the bottom of the page. It was my signature. A flawless, digitized forgery of my handwriting sat beneath a paragraph of dense legal jargon. Nathan had bypassed his firm's strict internal compliance protocols by listing my prestigious public relations firm as the primary financial guarantor for Kinsley Lifestyle, LLC. The true, horrifying scope of his scheme unfolded in clinical detail. He was actively diverting early-stage investor capital, money legally bound for legitimate tech startups, and funneling it directly into his Mistress's fake brand to artificially inflate its valuation. He was orchestrating a textbook embezzlement operation. My blood turned to ice, followed rapidly by a searing white-hot surge of pure adrenaline. He was not just committing federal wire fraud. He was actively framing me for the crime. If the Securities and Exchange Commission or the FBI audited his venture capital firm, the paper trail would point directly to my agency. My business, built from scratch through years of grueling work, would be implicated in a massive financial crime. His arrogance was breathtaking. He assumed my blind trust in our marriage would provide the perfect shield for his radioactive corporate theft. If this collapsed before I could cut the ties, I would not just lose my career and my reputation. I would face federal prison, and Leo would end up in the permanent custody of Patricia. The parameters of the battlefield shifted instantaneously. This was no longer a domestic dispute about a cheating husband. This was no longer a simple divorce where we haggled over alimony and real estate divisions. This was a fight for my freedom, my child, and my survival. The retaliation escalated from a clean break to a clinical, scorched earth asset extraction. I had to surgically detach my legal and financial identity from his toxic footprint before the federal authorities caught a scent of the rot. I connected a sterile, untraceable external hard drive to the laptop port. Moving with meticulous precision, I began downloading every forged document, every routing number, every hidden ledger, and every wire transfer receipt. I compiled a comprehensive matrix of his fraud, cross-referencing the diverted investor funds with the deposits made into Kinsley's shell company. I was weaving a digital noose, ensuring my own fingerprints were nowhere near his criminal enterprise. The transfer progress bar crawled across the screen, serving as a silent countdown to his ultimate destruction. I checked the timestamp on the forged guarantor document. It had been uploaded the exact same day he walked Kinsley through our front doors. The sheer sociopathy required to smile at your wife over dinner while signing her name to a federal crime was staggering. I ejected the hard drive, slipping the cool metal casing into the hidden lining of my briefcase. I closed the laptop, taking a microfiber cloth from my drawer to wipe the keyboard and the silver casing, removing any physical trace of my intrusion. I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped back into the hallway, leaving the fake gala brochures scattered convincingly across my desk. The penthouse was quiet. The laughter from the living room had ceased. I walked toward the kitchen to pour a glass of cold water, needing to ground my racing thoughts and prepare for the next phase of the extraction. As I turned the corner into the foyer, I stopped. Kinsley was standing by the floor-to-ceiling mirror near the entryway, adjusting her outfit for what Nathan had called a crucial business lunch. Draped carelessly around her neck was my limited edition silk scarf. It was a rare vintage piece I had purchased at a private auction in Paris years ago, featuring an intricate navy and gold pattern. She caught my reflection in the glass and froze for a split second, her hand resting on the delicate fabric. The challenge hung heavy in the air between us. She wanted to see if I would snap. She wanted to see if I would demand my property back, proving I was a petty, jealous wife threatened by her youth. It was a blatant assertion of dominance, a test of my breaking point. She had no idea the game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer fighting over fabric or seeking marital affection. I was looking at a co-conspirator in a federal fraud case, boldly wearing evidence purchased with stolen corporate funds. I offered her a serene, untroubled smile, complimenting the way the gold brought out her eyes, while my mind rapidly calculated how to ensure the security cameras captured every angle of her wearing that exact scarf. The silence in the foyer was heavy, thick, with the unspoken tension of two women standing on opposite sides of a battlefield. I watched Kinsley admire her reflection in the towering entryway mirror. My vintage silk scarf cascaded down the lapel of her beige trench coat, a stark contrast of deep navy and spun gold. The fabric was unmistakable. I had acquired that specific textile during a private auction in Paris, a rare hand-stitched weave that held a subtle iridescent sheen under the crystal chandelier. She stroked the delicate hem, her eyes meeting mine through the reflection in the glass. This was a deliberate provocation, an invitation to a dogfight. She wanted me to claim my territory, to snatch the silk from her neck and prove I felt threatened by her presence. She craved the validation of a scorned, jealous wife throwing a domestic tantrum. Instead, I leaned casually against the mahogany door frame and tilted my head, projecting a warm, admiring gaze. I told her the dark blue tones brought out the depth in her eyes, suggesting she keep it on for her business lunch with Nathan. Her smug satisfaction radiated through the corridor, a palpable wave of unearned triumph. She genuinely believed I was a pathetic, exhausted executive, a woman too beaten down by the corporate grind to fight for her own possessions. What she failed to realize was that I had positioned myself precisely 2 feet to her left, forcing her to step directly into the focal point of the motion-activated lens embedded in the hallway sconce. The hidden camera whirred silently, capturing high-definition footage of her adjusting the stolen fabric. But the lens caught something much more valuable than my vintage accessory. Resting on the console table, waiting to be looped over her arm, was a brand new, limited production, crocodile leather handbag. I knew the exact retail price of that purse, because I had seen the matching debit charge on the Kinsley Lifestyle LLC ledger just 20 minutes earlier. She was walking out of my home, draped in my personal history, clutching a bag purchased directly with embezzled venture capital. The scarf was merely a symbol of her parasitic nature, a petty theft meant to stroke her ego. The handbag, however, was tangible, irrefutable proof of her complicity in a federal crime. Nathan emerged from the master suite, adjusting his silver cufflinks, looking every inch the prestigious finance mogul. He kissed my forehead, delivering a seamless, practiced lie about a crucial investor meeting in Midtown Manhattan. Kinsley followed him out the door, playing the role of his eager, devoted assistant. The heavy deadbolt engaged, sealing me inside the pristine silence of the penthouse. The parameters of my reality had shifted entirely. The stakes were no longer confined to marital betrayal or shattered trust. The atmosphere in the apartment felt different, charged with the astronomical gravity of impending federal investigations. If the Securities and Exchange Commission caught wind of the missing startup capital, they would tear through Nathan's life like a Category 5 hurricane. Because my signature was forged on the guarantor documents, the blast radius would incinerate my public relations firm. I had spent a decade building my reputation as an elite crisis manager, navigating scandals for Fortune 500 companies. I refused to let my personal empire burn to the ground because my husband wanted to play sugar daddy to a 24-year-old barista. I had to surgically detach my legal and financial identity from his before the authorities caught a scent of the rot. I returned to my home office, my mind operating with the clinical, unfeeling precision of a forensic auditor. I opened my encrypted server and began constructing a digital labyrinth. This was not the diary of a broken heart. This was a prosecution matrix. Over the next few hours, I mapped the entire fraudulent ecosystem. The data flowed across my dual monitors, painting a terrifying picture of Nathan's greed. I traced the flow of capital from the prestigious tech investors through Nathan's firm and straight into the Delaware Shell Company. I cataloged the corresponding outflows, highlighting the ridiculous personal expenses masked as corporate overhead. There were receipts for 5-star hotel bookings, luxury car leases, premium spa treatments, and fine dining. I color-coded every transaction linking the financial theft directly to Kinsley's daily activities. I was building a lethal legal payload. I cross-referenced her LLC registration forms, proving she was not a naive bystander swept up in a romance. By signing her name as the primary beneficiary and operating manager of the lifestyle brand she had legally bound herself to the embezzlement scheme, she was actively receiving stolen assets across state lines. The legal term was co-conspirator. I poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, the bitter warmth grounding my racing thoughts. The woman who had worried about saving her marriage weeks ago was dead. The wife who felt a pang of grief over shattered vows had been systematically replaced by a tactical operative. Every time I looked at the security feeds, every time I sat across from them at the dining table passing the salt, I was gathering intelligence. When they returned from their lunch hours later, Kinsley was glowing. Her cheeks were flushed with wine and the thrill of playing a high-stakes corporate game with my husband. She offered me a sweet, patronizing smile, asking how my afternoon of party planning went. I smiled back, looking at the crocodile bag resting on the counter. I told her it was a highly productive afternoon, perhaps the most productive day I had experienced in years. Every time her lips curved into that smug, self-satisfied grin, I did not see a rival stealing my husband. I saw a suspect eagerly digging her own financial grave. She was wrapping a federal indictment around her throat, confusing it for a designer accessory. I knew I could not detonate this bomb on my own. The sheer complexity of severing my assets, protecting my firm, and executing a stealth divorce required a legal architect of the highest caliber. I needed someone who specialized in extracting high net worth individuals from radioactive marriages without triggering any public alarms. I needed a shark who operated in the shadows of New York's elite legal system. My thoughts drifted to a specific name, a litigator I had once recommended to a billionaire client facing a hostile takeover. This attorney did not negotiate. He annihilated. He was the perfect weapon for the war I was preparing to wage, but contacting him required extreme caution. Nathan monitored our joint accounts and frequently checked my calendar. I had to arrange a meeting under the flawless disguise of my ongoing domestic charade. The fake 40th birthday gala was about to provide the ultimate alibi, leading me straight into a room where a new brilliant twist was waiting to be uncovered in the digital shadows. The morning air in Manhattan held a crisp, biting chill as I stepped out of my residential building and slid into the back of a waiting town car. I carried a thick leather-bound binder overflowing with glossy photographs of imported orchids, rare peonies, and intricate floral arches. I had loudly announced to Nathan over breakfast that I was spending the next 3 hours in Chelsea, meeting with a premier event designer to finalize the botanical arrangements for his upcoming surprise birthday gala. He had offered a distracted nod, his eyes glued to his phone, entirely convinced his wife was busy obsessing over table centerpieces. I instructed the driver to drop me off 2 blocks away from the floral boutique. The moment the car pulled out of sight, I turned on my heel, hailed a yellow cab, and redirected my route south toward the financial district. The floral binder remained heavy in my lap, acting as the perfect physical alibi for my true destination. I arrived at a towering skyscraper, clad in dark, reflective glass. Taking the private executive elevator to the 54th floor, I stepped into a reception area defined by stark minimalism and the hushed, expensive silence of elite corporate law. This was the domain of Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was 50 years old, a man possessing the quiet, lethal grace of a great white shark navigating deep waters. He wore immaculate charcoal suits and spoke in a low, resonant baritone that commanded immediate submission. In the high-stakes ecosystem of New York wealth management, he was known as the ultimate asset extraction specialist. He did not handle messy, emotional family disputes. He represented billionaires, tech moguls, and Wall Street titans, orchestrating their legal separations with surgical precision. I had crossed paths with him 2 years prior, during a vicious corporate merger crisis. Now he was my chosen architect for the impending slaughter. He waited for me in his corner office, gesturing toward a sleek leather chair opposite his polished glass desk. We skipped the polite pleasantries. I opened my designer handbag, bypassing the fake floral swatches, and retrieved a small titanium encrypted flash drive. I slid the cool metal across the smooth glass surface. He picked it up, weighing it thoughtfully before inserting it into his terminal. I sat in perfect stillness, watching the reflection of the monitor flicker across his dark eyes as he navigated the meticulously organized folders I had compiled. He reviewed the forged guarantor signatures, the routed offshore wire transfers, and the corresponding debits from the Delaware Shell Company. Jonathan leaned back, pressing his fingertips together in a steeple. A slow, predatory smile touched the corners of his mouth. He murmured his approval, noting that most spouses brought him tear-stained text messages and hotel receipts. I had brought him a federal indictment wrapped in a bow. We quickly mapped out the framework for a synchronized stealth divorce. There would be no early warnings, no heated arguments over mediation, and no preliminary asset negotiations. We would weaponize the judicial system in total secrecy, preparing a labyrinth of filings ready to drop the second the 14-day countdown expired on Kinsley's household contract. But the financial forensics were only the opening act. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk, and told Jonathan to open the secondary folder labeled with the mistress's name. While auditing Nathan's laptop the previous day, I had utilized a diagnostic backdoor in our newly upgraded smart home network to intercept the wireless traffic flowing from Kinsley's mobile device. She believed she was operating in total privacy, casually using my high-speed internet to plot her own independent heist. The digital packets I captured revealed a staggering, breathtaking layer of treachery. Kinsley was not just a naive barista seduced by a wealthy older man. She was a calculating, cold-blooded extortionist. The encrypted chat logs I unspooled for Jonathan showed her communicating with a confidant back in her hometown. She detailed a meticulous scheme to bleed Nathan dry regardless of whether he ever left me. Her internet search history was a masterclass in criminal intent. She had spent hours researching how to purchase a positive pregnancy test on the black market, alongside deep dives into the tax implications of hush money payouts and corporate scandal settlements. Her endgame was brilliant in its malice. She intended to fabricate a pregnancy, approach the executive board of Nathan's venture capital firm, and claim the senior partner had used his power to coerce a vulnerable young employee into a compromising situation. She was drafting demand letters in her digital notepad, calculating a multi-million-dollar payout to sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away quietly. She planned to hold his entire professional reputation hostage. Jonathan let out a low, rich chuckle, the sound vibrating in the quiet office. The mistress was attempting to run a shakedown on a man currently embezzling federal funds to pay for her fake fashion brand. It was a spectacular ecosystem of mutual parasitism. We instantly weaponized this new intelligence. Knowing Kinsley posed an active, explosive threat to the venture capital firm provided the ultimate leverage. Jonathan drafted an emergency ex parte injunction, a rare and devastating legal maneuver designed for extreme circumstances. Backed by the evidence of wire fraud and impending extortion, this injunction would legally sever my financial identity from Nathan's the exact moment it was filed, protecting my public relations agency from the blast radius of their impending collision. We synchronized our watches. The trap was primed. The legal armor was forged, and the execution date was set in stone. I left the skyscraper holding my floral binder, hailing another cab to return uptown. The transition from the sterile, calculating environment of the law firm back to the suffocating domestic theater required a masterful psychological shift. The private elevator doors parted, depositing me directly into the foyer of my penthouse. The rich, savory aroma of roasted garlic and seared tenderloin drifted from the kitchen. Nathan was standing by the wine fridge, pouring a bold California red into 3 crystal goblets. Kinsley was sitting at my dining room table, arranging the linen napkins with an irritatingly cheerful expression. The contrast between the reality I knew and the illusion they were projecting was dizzying. I placed my binder on the console table, adopting the weary, hunched posture of an executive drained by endless vendor negotiations. I took my seat at the head of the table. Nathan handed me a glass of wine, asking how the floral appointments had gone. I sighed, rubbing my temples, and launched into a fabricated complaint about the exorbitant markup on imported white orchids leaning into the character of the stressed, devoted wife. Nathan offered a patronizing smile, praising my dedication to making his 40th birthday perfect. Kinsley watched me from across the table, her eyes glittering with a toxic mixture of pity and superiority. She reached for her water glass, taking a slow sip before resting her chin on her hand. She tilted her head, adopting a tone of faux concern that grated against my eardrums. She remarked that I looked terribly exhausted. She pointed out the faint shadows under my eyes, suggesting that perhaps I was pushing myself too hard, trying to balance my career and my household duties. It was a snide, calculated insult, a subtle reminder that she was the fresh, youthful energy breathing life into my supposedly failing home. I felt the cool, heavy crystal of the wineglass in my palm. My gaze locked onto hers. The silence stretched across the dining room, tight and vibrating with unspoken hostility. She thought she was staring at a tired, aging rival. She had no idea she was dining with her executioner. I did not snap. I did not rise to the bait. I simply lifted the glass to my lips, letting the rich, dark liquid coat my tongue. The taste was complex, dark, and incredibly satisfying. I offered her a soft, enigmatic smile, thanking her for the concern, assuring her that all the late nights and meticulous planning were about to pay off in ways no one could possibly anticipate. Nathan chuckled, raising his glass to toast the evening, entirely blind to the crosshairs painted on his forehead. I took another slow sip, silently savoring the exquisite, impending bloodbath. The groundwork was laid, but to ensure the destruction was absolute, I needed to invite a much larger audience into the theater. And Nathan was about to hand me the perfect opportunity. The atmosphere inside the penthouse was suffocatingly rich, heavy with the scent of seared Wagyu beef and imported truffles. Nathan had spared no expense for this particular dinner party. He invited the senior partners and top-tier executives from his venture capital firm, eager to project the image of a thriving, untouchable powerhouse. The dining room buzzed with the low, resonant hum of Wall Street veterans, swapping stories of hostile takeovers and eight-figure buyouts. Crystal goblets clinked under the ambient glow of the modern chandelier. I circulated through the room, wearing a tailored emerald gown, offering polite smiles and pouring vintage Bordeaux, playing the role of the ultimate corporate asset. Kinsley, however, decided to turn the evening into her own personal debutante ball. She wore a fitted crimson silk blouse and floated through my home like the lady of the manor. She bypassed her duties of watching over Leo in his playroom, opting instead to mingle with the financiers. She directed the private catering staff with sharp, commanding gestures, offering unearned opinions on the wine pairings. Tucked prominently into the deep plunge of her neckline, gleaming under the recessed lighting, was the heavy rose gold fountain pen I had gifted her. She wore it like a badge of honor, oblivious to the reality that it was the very instrument she had used to sign her own legal death warrant. Nathan leaned against the marble fireplace, holding a tumbler of scotch, soaking in the admiration of his peers. When a senior partner complimented the flawless execution of the evening, Nathan chuckled and pulled Kinsley closer by the shoulder. He projected a facade of paternal appreciation, but his eyes betrayed a slick, arrogant pride. He told the group that my public relations agency demanded so much of my schedule that I was practically a ghost in my own home. He openly joked that they had to hire Kinsley just to ensure the household did not collapse into total disarray. Several executives offered sympathetic, knowing nods, subtly undermining my career and reducing my worth to my domestic availability. Kinsley offered a demure, practiced blush, soaking up the validation. I took a slow sip of my mineral water, letting the insult wash over me without leaving a mark. I did not need their validation. I needed their paranoia. I scanned the room and located my primary target. Donovan Caldwell, the chief executive officer of the venture capital firm, was standing alone near the terrace doors. Donovan was a silver-haired veteran of the financial sector, a man possessing a mind like a steel trap and a notorious reputation for zero tolerance regarding compliance violations. He held his bourbon with a loose grip, staring out at the glittering expanse of the city skyline. I approached him with a warm, relaxed demeanor. We exchanged the standard industry pleasantries, discussing the turbulent quarterly markets and the shifting landscape of tech startups. Donovan praised Nathan, calling him a visionary rainmaker who consistently identified undervalued assets. I smiled, swirling the water in my glass, and carefully laid the bait. I told Donovan how proud I was of Nathan's recent strategic pivots. I kept my tone light, conversational, and entirely innocent. I mentioned that Nathan had been talking nonstop about the firm's new direction, specifically the aggressive push into direct-to-consumer fashion branding. Donovan frowned, a microscopic shift in his otherwise stoic expression. He replied that the firm strictly specialized in business-to-business software solutions, noting they had zero exposure in the retail or fashion sectors. I let a look of mild, playful confusion cross my face. I tilted my head, adopting the persona of a wife trying to recall a boring dinner table conversation. I told him that was strange because Nathan had explicitly mentioned leveraging $250,000 from the recent Series A escrow account. I casually dropped the exact name of the Delaware shell company, praising the structural efficiency of Kinsley Lifestyle LLC. I added that Nathan seemed incredibly focused on artificially scaling its valuation before the end of the fiscal quarter. The physical transformation in Donovan was instantaneous and terrifying to witness. The relaxed posture vanished. The muscles along his jawline tightened, pulling the skin taut. The seasoned financial predator recognized the distinct, undeniable scent of missing capital. His eyes darkened, scanning the room until they locked onto Nathan, who was currently laughing loudly by the fireplace. Donovan did not press me for more details. He did not ask for clarification. An executive of his caliber did not need a map to find a fire. He simply set his half-empty glass of bourbon down on a nearby side table with a sharp, definitive click. He offered a tight, forced smile, thanking me for the lovely evening, and stated he needed to make an urgent phone call. I watched him step out onto the freezing balcony, pulling his cell phone from his tailored jacket. The seed of a forensic corporate audit was successfully planted in the fertile soil of his suspicion. I had just initiated the destruction of my husband's career without leaving a single trace of my own fingerprints. I returned to the dining room, a profound sense of satisfaction settling in my chest. The catered dinner progressed flawlessly until dessert was served. My son Leo padded out of the hallway wearing his pajamas, rubbing his sleepy eyes. He was holding a heavy wooden toy train, searching for me in the crowd of strangers. Before I could cross the room to greet him, Kinsley intercepted the boy. She knelt down, projecting an image of maternal authority for the remaining guests. As she tried to guide him back toward the corridor, Leo slipped, dropping the heavy wooden train onto the imported hardwood floor. The toy landed with a loud, echoing clatter that silenced the surrounding conversations. Kinsley's performative sweetness evaporated in a flash of genuine annoyance. Emboldened by the wine and the attention of the wealthy executives, she forgot her place entirely. She grabbed Leo by the upper arm, her grip tight enough to make him flinch. She sharply reprimanded him, her voice a harsh, stinging hiss that carried across the quiet room. She told him he was being a clumsy, spoiled brat and ordered him to return to his room immediately. The temperature in the penthouse plummeted to freezing. I did not run. I did not shout. I moved across the dining room with a smooth, unhurried grace that commanded the absolute attention of every person present. The crowd parted, instinctively sensing the lethal shift in the atmospheric pressure. I reached them in seconds. I gently pried Kinsley's fingers off my son's arm, pulling Leo safely behind my legs. I did not look at Nathan. I did not acknowledge the stunned executives holding their dessert spoons in midair. I focused entirely on the 24-year-old girl playing house. I leaned forward, closing the distance until my lips were a fraction of an inch from her ear. The scent of her cheap vanilla perfume turned my stomach, but my voice remained a perfectly modulated, icy whisper. I told her that if she ever raised her voice at my child again, or dared to lay another finger on his skin, I would ensure she spent the rest of her natural life scrubbing floors to pay off the monumental debt she was about to owe me. Kinsley physically recoiled, stumbling backward onto her heels. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling. She looked into my eyes and saw the terrifying, unblinking void of a woman who had already secured her execution. For a split second, the facade of the clueless, overworked corporate wife slipped entirely. Kinsley realized she was not dealing with a victim. She was locked inside a cage with a monster, and the door was already welded shut. I straightened my posture, smoothing the fabric of my emerald gown. I turned back to the room of silent, staring executives. I offered a radiant, flawless smile, apologizing for the minor interruption and suggesting we move to the lounge for after-dinner espresso. The guests quickly complied, eager to escape the lingering tension, leaving Kinsley standing alone in the hallway, clutching her designer pen and drowning in a sudden, suffocating wave of pure dread. The clock ticked toward the final stages of the 14-day probationary window, and the air in the penthouse felt brittle, like a pane of glass vibrating before an inevitable shatter. Nathan and Kinsley were living in a state of high, frantic energy, spending money as if the fountain of venture capital would never run dry. They treated our home like a permanent playground, leaving trails of designer shopping bags and half-finished champagne bottles in every room, entirely oblivious to the fact that the floor beneath their feet had already been dissolved. My battle with Nathan was never a fair fight, because he played by the rules of ego, while I played by the rules of law. He walked through life with the strut of a man who believed his name on a utility bill was equivalent to sovereign ownership. He frequently boasted to his associates that our Manhattan penthouse was the crown jewel of his personal portfolio, a symbol of his hard-earned ascent into the upper echelons of New York society. He truly believed it was a joint asset, a piece of our marital fabric that he could leverage or divide should the mood ever strike him. He was dangerously wrong. The penthouse had been held for decades within the rigid, ironclad architecture of my late father's family trust. My father was a man who understood the inherent volatility of human nature and the destructive potential of bitter separations. He had insisted on embedding a very specific dormant provision within the trust's governing bylaws, a clause regarding morality and criminal liability. It was a failsafe, a final line of defense against anyone who might attempt to compromise the integrity of the family legacy. Jonathan and I had spent the last 72 hours finalizing the formal triggering of that clause. We had carefully compiled the evidence gathered during my clandestine audit of Nathan's digital footprint. The proof was irrefutable. By committing federal wire fraud on the premises and forging my signature on guarantor documents, Nathan had effectively detonated the ethical integrity of his occupancy. I sat in my office watching Jonathan's confirmation email pop up on my screen. He had officially filed the notice with the Trust's Board of Trustees. The impact was instantaneous and irrevocable. The Trust had formally invoked its authority to revoke Nathan's occupancy rights. In the eyes of the law, the man who had ordered me out of my own life just 2 weeks ago was now nothing more than a trespassing squatter. He had vaporized his own claim to the residence through his obsession with his own greed. But I could not afford to stop at merely reclaiming the roof over our heads. I had to ensure he was stripped of the very capital he used to finance his infidelity. The bank accounts associated with the Delaware shell company, the Kinsley Lifestyle LLC, were still actively cycling through the startup funds Nathan had siphoned. I met with a lead investigator at our family's private banking institution. I brought forward the necessary documentation proving that the $250,000 transferred into the LLC had been purloined from an irrevocable trust established for the benefit of a minor. In the American banking system, the unauthorized movement of custodial trust assets is a cardinal sin. It is not merely a civil dispute. It is a direct violation of the fiduciary responsibilities that govern every financial institution. The bank's legal team acted with terrifying efficiency. They initiated a silent, mandatory recall of the entire sum. They flagged the Delaware entity for suspicious activity, classifying the movement of funds as a potential case of embezzlement from a protected trust. By the time the sun began its descent that afternoon, every single account connected to Kinsley Lifestyle LLC had been frozen solid. The payoff occurred shortly after 4 o'clock. Kinsley had spent the afternoon at a high-end boutique on Madison Avenue, apparently intent on purchasing a new wardrobe for their planned getaway to Aspen. I received a real-time notification from the credit card monitoring service I had linked to their secondary accounts. She had attempted a transaction totaling $4,000 for a series of cashmere sweaters and artisan leather accessories. The transaction was declined. She attempted it a second time. Declined. The boutique manager, likely sensing an issue with the card, asked for a secondary form of payment. Kinsley attempted to use the debit card issued to the LLC. Declined again. I watched the play-by-play unfolding on my secure monitoring dashboard. I could almost visualize the scene, the growing embarrassment of the boutique staff, the nervous murmuring of the other shoppers, and the frantic, rising panic in Kinsley's eyes as she realized her access to the world of easy luxury had been abruptly severed. She called Nathan. I tapped the microphone on my desk, activating the voice logging software that mirrored his phone's audio path. Nathan's voice came through jagged and impatient. He was likely in the middle of another high-pressure investor call, stressed by the impending corporate audit I had tipped off. He snapped at her, demanding to know why she was calling him during market hours. Kinsley's response was a stuttering, desperate mess. She explained the situation at the boutique, her voice cracking with the indignity of being treated like a common fraud. Nathan told her it was simply a banking glitch, likely a routine security hold due to the recent volume of their spending. He commanded her to leave the items and meet him at the office lobby in 20 minutes so they could resolve the issue together. He dismissed the entire disaster as a mere technical error, a minor inconvenience that would be sorted out with a single phone call. He had no concept of the reality that had just manifested. He was acting like a man who believed the world was still bending to his whim, entirely blind to the fact that the financial guillotine had just dropped on his neck. I closed the dashboard and stood up, walking toward the window. The city looked different from up here. The streetlights were beginning to flicker to life, casting long golden ribbons across the pavement. I watched the flow of traffic, the constant pulsing movement of people rushing home, unaware of the quiet, clinical warfare taking place in the boardrooms and legal offices above them. My home felt clean for the first time in weeks. I had successfully reclaimed the legal sanctity of the penthouse and severed the financial arteries of their affair. They were currently rushing toward a collision with reality, still laughing at their own reflection, still convinced they were the architects of a perfect life. I felt a surge of cold, quiet power. The psychological pressure was escalating, but I remained unmovable. I knew how Nathan would react. He would attempt to bully the bank, he would threaten the boutique manager, and he would eventually demand an audience with the head of his venture capital firm. He would lash out in every direction, desperate to reestablish his sense of control. Every move he made would only serve to reveal more of his fraudulent ledger. Every phone call he placed would be another recording I could add to the growing mountain of evidence. Every dollar he attempted to reclaim would be another entry in the federal investigation that was already, slowly, inevitably forming around him. The trap was fully operational, and the pieces were moving exactly as I had predicted. The countdown had entered its final, most devastating phase. I poured a glass of water, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat, and turned away from the window. I had a dinner date with my son, an evening of normalcy before the storm finally broke. I would let them sleep one last night in the luxury of their delusion, because tomorrow, the Aspen trip was happening, and Nathan was about to learn exactly how far a man can fall when he mistakes his own arrogance for absolute truth. Day 14 dawned with a pale slate gray light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Manhattan skyline. The penthouse was quiet, save for the rhythmic zip of a heavy canvas duffel bag being sealed in the master suite. Nathan bounded down the curved glass staircase a few minutes later, clad in premium weather-resistant winter gear. He wore a designer ski jacket, exuding the crisp, energetic aura of a man preparing to conquer a mountain. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Queens, my husband had spent his entire adult life overcompensating for his modest roots. Aspen was not just a vacation destination for him. It was a geographical status symbol, a place where he could rub shoulders with the generational wealth he so desperately craved. He checked his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting the collar of his thermal shirt with practiced vanity. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and turned to me, delivering a flawless, rehearsed fabrication. He claimed an emergency investor retreat had been called at the last minute to discuss a volatile tech merger. He spoke with the commanding cadence of a titan of industry, kissing my cheek and apologizing for leaving me alone on a winter weekend. I inhaled the faint scent of his peppermint shaving cream, maintaining a bright, supportive grin. I told him to go close the deal, adjusting his lapel with the gentle, precise touch of a devoted partner. An hour after his town car departed, Kinsley emerged from the guest corridor. She had swapped her usual provocative attire for a modest, oversized knit sweater and denim jeans, lugging her monogrammed suitcase behind her. Her performance was equally calculated. She offered a tight, solemn expression, claiming her elderly aunt in Ohio had fallen severely ill, and she needed a few days of emergency family leave. She had often spun tragic tales about her upbringing in the Midwest, portraying herself as a resilient survivor of a fractured family to garner sympathy from wealthy men. I knew from my initial background check that her aunt had been dead for 6 years, but I did not let a fraction of that knowledge breach my expression. I walked over to the kitchen island and retrieved a crisp ivory envelope. Inside was her final weekly paycheck, calculated down to the last cent. I handed it to her, expressing my deepest sympathies for her fictional relative. I told her to take all the time she needed, letting my voice carry a tone of warm, maternal reassurance. Her fingers closed around the thick paper, her eyes flashing with a fleeting spark of triumphant smugness. She thanked me, hoisted her leather bag, and walked out to meet her waiting rideshare. The heavy mahogany door swung on its custom hinges and shut with a definitive metallic click. The deadbolt engaged automatically. The echo of the closing latch reverberated through the silent foyer, serving as the starting gun for the most catastrophic event of their lives. The illusion of the subservient corporate wife evaporated instantly, shedding from my skin like a molted shell. The air in the penthouse felt lighter, charged with the crackling electricity of impending justice. I walked back to my workspace, my footsteps echoing against the hardwood floors with steady, unhurried purpose. I picked up my smartphone from the glass desk, the screen illuminated, displaying an open, encrypted chat thread with Jonathan Pierce. I typed a single, definitive word: execute. I pressed send. The digital command crossed the city in a millisecond, striking Jonathan's terminal and setting a devastating legal avalanche into motion. The machinery of the New York judicial system, preloaded and primed for days, fired simultaneously across multiple jurisdictions. The temporary restraining order was formally logged with the county clerk, establishing an impenetrable legal barrier around my physical person and my primary residence. The stealth divorce petition was registered, bearing the undeniable weight of marital fraud and financial misconduct. Concurrently, the emergency asset freeze locked down every remaining joint account, credit line, and investment portfolio tied to Nathan's name. The bank executives, already on high alert from the previous day's trust fund recall, eagerly slammed the vault doors shut. His financial lifeblood was drained in the span of 30 seconds, leaving behind an empty, hollow shell of a portfolio. But the legal separation was merely the precursor to the main event. I opened my secure, untraceable email client. The encrypted dossier containing every forged guarantor document, every illicit wire transfer, and the comprehensive map of the embezzlement matrix sat in my outbox. I attached the file and addressed the email directly to the internal compliance board of his venture capital firm, copying Donovan Caldwell, the chief executive officer. I hit send, watching the progress bar fill the screen until the interface confirmed delivery. The payload had been delivered. I leaned back in my leather chair, taking a deep, restorative breath. I visualized the profound contrast between my serene, untouchable sanctuary and the impending chaos unfolding miles above the earth. At this exact moment, Nathan and Kinsley were sitting side by side in the plush leather seats of a first-class cabin cruising at an altitude of 30,000 feet. They were likely sipping complimentary champagne out of crystal flutes, laughing softly under the hum of the jet engines, reveling in the success of their grand deception. They were soaring through the clouds, wrapped in a cocoon of unearned luxury and supreme arrogance, entirely blind to the reality waiting for them on the tarmac. They believed they were flying toward a romantic winter wonderland, a playground for the rich and untouchable. They had no idea that the ground below them had been scorched to ash, that their entire empire had been systematically incinerated while they were trapped inside a metal tube in the sky. The 14-day probationary clock had run its course, and the destination they were rapidly approaching was not a luxury resort, but a barren, unforgiving wasteland. The exact minute the digital clock on my office terminal struck noon in New York, the 14-day probationary window on Kinsley's employment contract officially expired. 2,000 miles away, in the crisp, thin air of the Rocky Mountains, the trap snapped shut with bone-crushing precision. Through the subsequent alerts firing across my monitoring software and the detailed security reports I received later, I knew exactly how the execution unfolded. Nathan and Kinsley stepped out of a premium chauffeured SUV and walked through the soaring timber doors of an ultra-exclusive Aspen resort. The lobby was a masterpiece of alpine opulence, featuring a colossal riverstone fireplace, antler chandeliers, and the rich scent of burning cedar mixed with expensive leather. The room was populated by the financial elite, tech billionaires and hedge fund managers dressed in cashmere, chatting softly over artisanal cocktails. This was the exact social echelon my husband worshipped. It was the perfect stage for his ultimate humiliation. Kinsley approached the concierge desk with the haughty posture of a woman who believed she had finally arrived. She rested her stolen designer handbag on the polished mahogany counter, offering her identification to the impeccably dressed clerk. She requested the keys to the panoramic suite Nathan had booked months in advance, back when he still had access to his venture capital expense accounts. The clerk typed the information into the terminal, offering a polite, practiced smile. He requested a credit card for incidentals. Kinsley eagerly produced the sleek black card tied to her newly formed LLC, eager to flex her unearned financial muscle. The clerk inserted the chip. The terminal processed the request for 3 seconds before emitting a sharp, discordant beep. The clerk frowned, keeping his tone hushed and respectful, informing her that the transaction had been declined. Kinsley let out a breath of irritation, her cheeks flushing a faint shade of pink. She muttered something about a bank error and produced a second card, this one a personal platinum account tied to Nathan's primary bank. The clerk tried again. Another sharp beep. Declined. The soft murmur of conversation in the lobby seemed to amplify as the delay stretched on. Nathan, noticing the holdup, strolled over to the counter. He projected supreme confidence, annoyed that his grand entrance was being stalled by trivial administrative issues. He flashed a condescending smile at the clerk, pulled out his own premium corporate card, and instructed the man to run it for the full stay. The terminal rejected his card in a fraction of a second. The account no longer existed. Nathan froze. His arrogant smirk faltered, replaced by a deep, unsettling confusion. He demanded the clerk try it again, his voice rising in volume, drawing the curious glances of the wealthy patrons nearby. He began to berate the hotel staff, blaming their faulty network, entirely blind to the reality that his financial arteries had been surgically severed hours ago. Before he could demand to speak to the general manager, a man stepped out from the crowd resting near the fireplace. He wore a heavy wool sweater and snow boots, blending seamlessly with the affluent tourists. But he was not there for a ski holiday. In elite resort towns, process servers are trained to operate like ghosts. The man approached the counter, stepping directly into Nathan's personal space. He asked for Nathaniel Brooks. Nathan, still arguing with the concierge, turned and snapped a confirmation. The man reached inside his coat and produced a thick, heavy manila envelope. He pressed it firmly into Nathan's chest, stating loudly and clearly that he had been officially served on behalf of the New York State Supreme Court. The man turned on his heel and walked out the glass doors, dissolving back into the snowy afternoon. Nathan stared down at the envelope. His hands began to tremble. He ripped open the seal, pulling out a dense stack of legal filings. The bold black lettering on the cover page hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was the stealth divorce petition, accompanied by the emergency ex parte injunction freezing his assets. Tucked directly beneath the marital filings was the formal eviction notice, executed by my family trust, citing criminal liability and fraud. The documents detailed the exact dates, times, and routing numbers of his embezzlement scheme. The illusion of his secure, dominant lifestyle shattered into jagged pieces on the lobby floor. Before he could even process the sheer volume of his legal ruin, his cell phone began to vibrate in his jacket pocket. He pulled it out with shaking fingers. The caller ID displayed the name Donovan Caldwell, the chief executive officer of his venture capital firm. Nathan swiped the screen to answer, pressing the phone to his ear. He tried to muster his usual slick, confident greeting, but his voice cracked, coming out as a dry, terrified rasp. Donovan did not offer a greeting. His tone was a razor blade slicing through the cellular connection. He informed Nathan that the internal compliance audit had just concluded. The forensic accountants had verified the forged guarantor documents and traced the missing Series A investor capital directly to the Delaware Shell Company. Nathan opened his mouth to stammer a defense, to spin a web of plausible deniability, but Donovan cut him off with lethal efficiency. The CEO stated that Nathan was terminated for cause, effective immediately. His unvested equity was permanently voided. Security personnel were currently clearing out his corner office, placing his personal effects into cardboard boxes on the New York pavement. Then came the killing strike. Donovan lowered his voice, delivering the final verdict. He revealed that the firm had turned the entire encrypted dossier over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal agents were already drafting the subpoenas. Nathan was instructed to cease all contact with the firm, its partners, and its clients. The connection clicked dead, leaving only the hollow dial tone echoing in Nathan's ear. He stood paralyzed in the center of the grand lobby. The phone slipped from his grasp, clattering against the polished stone floor. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and sweating in his premium winter gear. He was no longer a prestigious rainmaker. He was an unemployed, bankrupt pariah, staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. Kinsley watched him fall apart. She snatched the legal documents from his limp hands, her eyes darting across the eviction notices and the asset freezes. Her survival instincts, honed from years of maneuvering through the service industry, searching for a wealthy savior, kicked into overdrive. She realized in a terrifying heartbeat that the man standing next to her was not a ticket to high society. He was a radioactive liability, a sinking ship, poised to drag her down into the crushing depths of a federal wire fraud conspiracy. The demure, loving mistress persona evaporated. She turned on him with the ferocity of a cornered predator. Right there in the opulent lobby, surrounded by the elite society Nathan so desperately wanted to impress, Kinsley unleashed a visceral, ear-splitting tirade. She screamed that he was a pathetic fraud, a con artist who had dragged her into his mess. She hurled the legal documents at his chest, the papers fluttering to the ground like dead leaves. She demanded to know how he planned to pay for her flight home, her voice echoing off the vaulted timber ceilings, transforming his private destruction into a grotesque public spectacle. The wealthy patrons lowered their cocktails, staring in unabashed fascination at the wealthy executive being torn apart by his much younger companion. The humiliation was total, absolute, and inescapable. She did not wait for his answer. Kinsley grabbed the handle of her monogrammed suitcase, spun around, and marched toward the exit, leaving him isolated in a sea of judging eyes. Desperation clawed at Nathan's throat. He fell to his knees, ignoring the stares of the hotel staff, and scrambled to retrieve his dropped phone. His fingers flew across the cracked screen, opening his mobile banking applications, praying for a hidden reserve, a forgotten account, anything to purchase a ticket out of this nightmare. The loading icon spun on the screen, a digital hourglass mocking his ruin. The dashboard finally rendered. Available balance, $0.00. He toggled frantically to his offshore accounts, his savings, his checking. 0, 0, 0. He sat on the floor of the St. Regis, the crisp mountain air blowing through the sliding glass doors, shivering uncontrollably. Stripped of his career, his wealth, his home, and his dignity, he was entirely stranded in the freezing altitude, staring into the terrifying void of a future he had ruthlessly built for himself. While a spectacular public meltdown tore through the alpine air of Colorado, a profound and clinical order prevailed 2,000 miles away in New York. The atmosphere inside the Manhattan penthouse was serene, punctuated only by the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the study. I sat at my desk, sipping a cup of green tea, watching the digital confirmation of Nathan's termination synchronize across my monitoring software. The destruction of his career was a masterpiece of corporate retaliation, but my domestic sanctuary still required a thorough forensic cleansing. I opened my encrypted files and retrieved the scanned copy of the household employment package. My eyes traced the looping cursive signature Kinsley had so eagerly provided on the resignation and vacate agreement. She had traded her legal protections for a designer pen, handing me the unilateral authority to erase her footprint from my home. I drafted a brief formal email attaching the signed contract. I informed her that her probationary employment was terminated effective immediately due to gross misconduct and breach of the non-disclosure clause. I pressed send, delivering the electronic eviction notice to a woman currently screaming in a hotel lobby. 5 minutes later, the service elevator chimed at the end of the hallway. I opened the rear entrance to admit a highly specialized relocation crew. I had not hired a standard moving company. Standard movers use delicate tissue paper padded blankets and labeled cardboard boxes. I contracted an elite estate clearance team that specialized in rapid, unceremonious extractions. 4 men dressed in unmarked gray uniforms stepped into the corridor carrying rolls of thick, industrial-grade contractor bags. They did not speak. They simply waited for my instruction. I led the crew supervisor down the hall and opened the door to the guest suite. The room still reeked of that cheap vanilla perfume, an offensive odor clinging to the expensive linen curtains. Her open vanity case sat on the dresser, spilling generic cosmetics across the polished wood. Her clothing was scattered across the duvet. I stood in the doorway, folding my arms, and gave a single quiet directive to clear the room. The crew moved with terrifying, beautiful efficiency. They unfurled the heavy black plastic bags, the material snapping sharply in the quiet room. They swept their arms across the dresser, knocking her makeup palettes, hair tools, and cheap jewelry directly into the yawning plastic maws. There was no sorting. There was no respect for her possessions. The counterfeit designer shoes she had brought into my home were tossed carelessly on top of her drugstore lotions. One of the men opened the closet, grabbing armfuls of the luxury garments Nathan had purchased for her using stolen trust funds. The expensive fabrics were unceremoniously shoved into the dark plastic, crushed under the weight of her vanity items. I watched the worker reach for a familiar flash of navy and gold. It was my vintage silk scarf, the one she had draped around her neck to flaunt her perceived dominance just days prior. The fabric hung from the man's gloved hand. A lesser woman might have reclaimed the accessory, treating it as a recovered prize, but the silk was tainted. It had touched her skin. It carried the stench of her delusion. It was no longer a piece of my history. It was a symbol of a parasitic infection. I met the worker's eyes and gave a subtle nod toward the contractor bag. He dropped the rare imported silk into the trash along with the rest of her debris. In less than 45 minutes, the guest suite was entirely stripped bare. Every drawer was empty, every hanger removed. The physical manifestation of her existence in my home was reduced to 6 bulging black trash bags sitting by the service elevator. I directed my housekeeper to open all the windows and deep clean the room with heavy citrus solvents, neutralizing the lingering scent of the trail. The clearance team loaded the bags onto their heavy metal carts, but their job was only half finished. I handed the supervisor a printed address and a prepaid receipt. The destination was not a climate-controlled storage facility in Manhattan. I had secured a unit in a decaying, rusted, corrugated metal complex tucked beneath a roaring highway overpass in the deepest corners of Queens. The facility offered 0 temperature regulation, meaning her stolen designer clothing and cheap cosmetics would bake in the summer heat and freeze during the brutal New York winters. The crew would dump the unmarked bags onto the cracked concrete floor, leaving her glamorous high society fantasy to rot in a desolate industrial park. I had already paid the first month of rent. I held the solitary brass key to the padlock in my palm. I slid the jagged metal into a padded envelope, wrote out a certified shipping label, and addressed it to her parents' modest suburban home in Ohio. If Kinsley wanted to retrieve her trash, she would have to explain her catastrophic failure to the very family she had lied to about her whereabouts. As the service elevator doors closed, taking the clearance crew and the remnants of the Mistress away forever, the front doorbell chimed. The second phase of the physical lockdown had arrived. A pair of technicians from a premier security firm stood on my threshold, carrying heavy steel toolboxes. I greeted them, directing them toward the main entryway and the rear service doors. 2 weeks ago, I had fed Nathan and Kinsley a lie about upgrading the smart home network to monitor a child's screen time. That fabrication provided the perfect cover for scheduling this exact appointment. The technicians went to work their power drills, whining sharply as they dismantled the traditional brass deadbolts and keyholes. Nathan believed that holding a physical key granted him ultimate authority over the residents. That key was now a useless piece of jagged metal. In place of the old hardware, the technicians installed sleek, matte black titanium biometric scanners. The new locking mechanisms were military-grade, requiring a dual authentication of a registered fingerprint and an encrypted retinal scan. The heavy steel bolts slid into the reinforced door frames with a satisfying, definitive thud. The technician synced the control hub directly to my smartphone, transferring ultimate administrative authority into the palm of my hand. I placed my thumb against the cool glass of the primary scanner. The ring illuminated with a soft blue light, and the lock disengaged seamlessly. My perimeter was secure. The penthouse was now an impenetrable fortress, responding only to my unique biological signature. Anyone else attempting to gain entry would be met with an unyielding wall of reinforced steel. I signed the technician's work order, thanking them for their swift installation, and locked the doors behind them. The silence that descended upon the apartment was profound. It was not the heavy, tense quiet of a looming confrontation. It was the pristine, soaring tranquility of a reclaimed sanctuary. I walked slowly through the sweeping corridors, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood. The air smelled of fresh citrus and expensive beeswax polish. The oppressive, suffocating weight of their deception had been surgically excised from the premises. I stepped into the kitchen and walked over to the custom, climate-controlled wine fridge. I selected a bottle of vintage Cabernet, a rare vintage I had been saving for a moment of true celebration. The cork popped with a sharp, festive echo. I poured the dark ruby liquid into a wide crystal goblet, watching the rich legs cling to the sides of the glass. Carrying the wine, I walked into the expansive living room and stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows. The New York skyline stretched out before me, a glittering, pulsing grid of infinite power and ambition. The fading afternoon sun cast long golden reflections across the glass skyscrapers. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the Cabernet, savoring the complex notes of dark cherry and oak. The Trojan horse that Nathan had so arrogantly wheeled into my life was burned to ashes. I had neutralized the threat, protected my child, and insulated my corporate empire from his radioactive crimes. The primary battle was won, and the traitors were currently drowning in the consequences of their own spectacular greed. But a master strategist knows that a war is never truly over until the enabling forces are also dismantled. As I took another sip of wine, reveling in the uncontaminated air of my home, the intercom system mounted on the kitchen wall emitted a sharp, urgent buzz. I walked over and tapped the screen, bringing up the video feed from the lobby concierge desk. The doorman looked stressed, shifting uncomfortably on his feet. Standing directly behind him, her face flushed with a terrifying, unhinged fury, was Patricia. Nathan's mother had received the frantic call from Colorado, and the matriarch had arrived to demand answers. The final loose end had just walked willingly into the crosshairs. The digital feed from the lobby camera displayed a scene of undeniable chaos. Vincent, our veteran concierge, who usually possessed the stoic calm of a palace guard, looked visibly stressed. He stood near the polished brass entryway, shifting his weight awkwardly. Hovering directly over his shoulder was Patricia. My mother-in-law wore a pristine, pearl-colored designer suit, but her aristocratic composure had fractured. Her face was flushed a deep, blotchy crimson. Strands of her immaculate blowout had come loose, framing eyes wide with manic panic. She had clearly received a hysterical, fragmented phone call from the Rocky Mountains. Her golden boy was stranded and broke, and she had rushed into the city to reclaim his territory. I set my crystal goblet on the counter and tapped the intercom icon. Vincent spoke first, his voice tight with discomfort. He informed me that Mrs. Brooks was demanding immediate entry to the residence. Before he could finish his sentence, Patricia shoved past the concierge, leaning her face directly into the camera lens. Her voice pierced the small speaker, a shrill, demanding shriek that shattered the refined quiet of the lobby. She ordered me to disengage the elevators this instant. She declared she was coming upstairs to secure her son's home and collect his belongings. She branded me a hysterical, vindictive woman who had lost her mind. I leaned closer to the microphone. I kept my tone smooth, infusing it with icy, detached professionalism. I informed her she was trespassing. I stated clearly that Nathan no longer held any legal occupancy rights to the penthouse, and by extension, she was not on the approved visitor registry. The rejection hit her like a physical strike. Her eyes widened, and the entitlement she had nurtured for decades boiled over into a venomous tirade. She gripped the edge of the concierge desk, her knuckles turning white. She threatened to drag my name through the mud of every elite social circle on the Eastern Seaboard. She swore to ruin my public relations agency, promising to leverage her extensive network at the premier Westchester Country Club to blacklist my corporate clients. She bragged about her unassailable reputation, vowing to paint me as an unstable, negligent mother who had driven a good man away. I listened to her hollow threats, a soft smile touching the corners of my mouth. She was playing a game of social checkers, entirely unaware that the board had already been flipped. I instructed Vincent to summon building security and escort the unauthorized visitor off the premises. Then I terminated the connection, cutting off her screeching mid-sentence. I walked briskly into my home office, the adrenaline sharpening my focus. Patricia's entire identity was anchored to a pristine public image. She reigned over the suburban charity gala circuit with an iron fist, utilizing her husband's retired hedge fund fortune to buy loyalty and command respect. Her husband Charles was a man who despised public scandal above all else. He preferred to operate in the quiet, undisturbed shadows of old money, and he demanded flawless decorum from his wife. Patricia had just threatened to initiate a public smear campaign against me. It was time to show her the true definition of a ruined reputation. I booted up my secure laptop and accessed the encrypted cloud server. I located the audio file I had extracted from the guest suite smoke detector just days prior. The file contained the crystal-clear, high-definition recording of Patricia sitting in my home, sipping my tea while actively coaching a 24-year-old mistress on how to fabricate evidence of maternal neglect. I drafted a new email, keeping the text brief and devastatingly polite. I wrote that it had come to my attention that certain ethical boundaries were being breached within our shared community, and I felt a moral obligation to provide transparency regarding the situation. I moved to the recipient field and began constructing the ultimate distribution list. First, I entered the private email addresses for the board of directors and the ethics committee of the Westchester Country Club. These were the women Patricia viewed as her peers and her subordinates. Next, I added the editor-in-chief of a highly exclusive, invite-only Manhattan socialite newsletter, known for publishing ruinous blind items. Finally, in the direct recipient line, I typed the personal email address of Charles Brooks. I attached the audio file. I did not hesitate. I clicked send. The digital payload soared through cyberspace, carrying the unvarnished, ugly truth of her character. The fallout was instantaneous and catastrophic. I envisioned the sequence of events unfolding across the affluent suburbs. Board members sitting down for afternoon tea, their smartphones chiming in unison. They would tap the audio file, expecting a mundane neighborhood update. Instead, they would hear Patricia's unmistakable elitist drawl explicitly endorsing marital sabotage. They would listen in horrified fascination as she advised a young girl on how to steal a child and drain a family trust. The sheer malice in her voice would strip away the elegant, charitable persona she had spent 40 years cultivating. In the cutthroat ecosystem of high society, a scandal of this magnitude is unforgivable. The judgment would be swift and merciless. Within 45 minutes, my phone pinged with a notification from the socialite newsletter. A breaking alert had just been published. While it did not use full names to avoid immediate legal friction, the details were so hyper-specific that anyone in the New York elite would instantly identify the disgraced matriarch. The article mocked her hypocrisy, painting her as a conniving, morally bankrupt villain plotting against her own grandchild. But the ultimate blow came from within her own household. Charles received the email while sitting in his mahogany-paneled study. Listening to his wife plot a hostile takeover of a minor's trust fund, thereby exposing their own family to severe legal liabilities and public disgrace, shattered his tolerance. Charles was a man of fierce, unforgiving pride. He recognized that Patricia's reckless meddling had compromised their pristine social standing. He did not engage in a screaming match. He picked up his phone and called his private wealth manager. By the time Patricia's chauffeured car pulled into the sweeping driveway of her sprawling suburban mansion, her reality had been dismantled. She stepped into the foyer to find her credit cards frozen and her access to the primary joint checking accounts revoked. Charles had effectively locked down her personal spending power, treating her not as a partner, but as an urgent financial liability. Her phone began to ring not with offers of support, but with cold, formal notifications. The charity committee chairs texted her to suggest she step down from her leadership roles, citing unforeseen personal conflicts. Her supposed friends ignored her calls, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of her exposed conspiracy. To ensure the silence was permanent, I had Jonathan draft and dispatch a targeted cease and desist letter via an expedited courier. The document arrived at her doorstep before the sun set. It outlined the strict legal parameters of a looming civil defamation suit. Jonathan's language was razor-sharp, promising that if Patricia ever spoke my name in public again or attempted to contact my son, we would drag her remaining assets into a brutal, highly publicized courtroom battle. She was stripped of her social crown, cut off from her financial lifeblood, and muzzled by the terrifying weight of the law. The arrogant enabler who had smirked over brunch while plotting my downfall was now trapped in a cavernous, empty house. She was left weeping in the grand foyer, surrounded by imported antiques, entirely ostracized by the very circles she worshipped, gagged and powerless. The secondary threats had been neutralized, the perimeter secured, and the enablers crushed. The chessboard was nearly clear. I returned to the living room window, looking out over the darkening city streets. A notification chimed on my tablet, drawing my attention back to the screen. It was an alert from the flight tracking software I had installed on Nathan's devices weeks ago. He had managed to secure a boarding pass. Pawning his luxury watch in Colorado had apparently yielded just enough cash for a middle seat on a budget airline. The tracking dot on the digital map showed his flight descending toward John F. Kennedy International Airport. The final boss was bruised, broken, and operating on sheer desperation, hurtling back to the city to try and reclaim his lost kingdom. The endgame was rapidly approaching, and my newly installed biometric locks were waiting to deliver his final, crushing reality check. Nathan Brooks. A man who had built his entire identity on premium status upgrades and private airport lounges, spent the final 5 hours of his return trip wedged into a middle seat near the rear lavatory of a discount commercial airline. To secure that miserable ticket, he had been forced to pawn his prized platinum chronograph at a steep loss to a shady dealer in a Colorado strip mall. His bespoke wool trousers were wrinkled, his jaw was covered in silver stubble, and his skin carried a damp, sour sheen of nervous sweat. He was operating on pure, desperate rage. He stared at the stained fabric of the seat in front of him, grinding his teeth until his jaw ached. In his mind, he was still the ruler of his domain. He spent the entire flight rehearsing the confrontation, planning exactly how he would kick the heavy front doors open, demand the restoration of his bank accounts, and reassert his patriarchal authority over the household. He landed at John F. Kennedy International Airport deep into the evening. There was no sleek black car waiting at the curb holding a placard bearing his surname. His corporate travel accounts were frozen solid, forcing him to stand in the freezing rain and wait for a standard yellow taxi. The ride through the congested boroughs took an hour and a half, giving his fury ample time to ferment into a toxic, blinding obsession. He directed the driver to our Tribeca address, tossing his last few crumpled bills through the partition, and grabbed his single nylon duffel bag. He stormed through the revolving glass doors of the luxury high-rise, bypassing the concierge desk entirely. Vincent, the night manager, stepped forward, but Nathan ignored him, moving with the entitled momentum of a resident who owned the air he breathed. He swiped his fob against the private elevator panel. The system recognized the fob because I had intentionally left that specific access point active. I wanted him to ride that elevator. I wanted him to stand in the hallway and face the physical manifestation of his ruin. The polished steel doors closed, carrying him upward to the penthouse level. The chime echoed through the silent corridor as the doors parted. Nathan stepped out, dropping his cheap duffel bag onto the imported runner rug. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out his brass key, his eyes locked on the spot where the traditional deadbolt used to reside. He froze. The brass fixture was gone. In its place sat the sleek, matte black titanium biometric scanner, a silent sentinel guarding my sanctuary. The realization that I had altered the physical architecture of the home struck him, but his arrogance overrode his logic. He assumed it was just another expensive toy, a new gadget he could easily bypass. He stepped up to the reinforced oak door and jammed his thumb against the glowing glass reader. He expected the heavy internal bolts to slide back with a satisfying mechanical click. Instead, the interface emitted a harsh, discordant beep. The circular rim flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. A small digital display illuminated, projecting two brutal words: "Access denied." He blinked, swiping his thumb on his trousers to remove the nervous sweat, and pressed it against the glass a second time. Red light. Access denied. A third time. The machine locked him out, initiating a temporary security cooldown. The last remaining shred of his corporate composure snapped. He raised his bare fists and began pounding on the heavy oak, the dull thuds echoing down the pristine hallway. He screamed my name, his voice cracking with a frantic, unhinged hysteria. He ordered me to open the door, threatening to tear the frame out of the wall, demanding I fix what he assumed was a ridiculous technological glitch. He hurled insults, his face flushed dark red, spit flying from his lips as he battered his knuckles against the unyielding wood. I stood less than 3 feet away on the other side of that door, holding a steaming cup of chamomile tea. I watched his spectacular meltdown play out in high definition on the security tablet mounted in the foyer. The acoustic dampening in the walls muffled his screams into pathetic, hollow groans. I did not say a word. I did not engage the intercom to mock him. I simply took a slow sip of my tea, savoring the profound futility of his rage. He was a ghost, haunting a house that no longer belonged to him. The private elevator timed again. The steel doors slid open, revealing 3 members of the building's armed security team. They were led by the head of residential safety, a former detective who did not tolerate disturbances in the luxury corridors. Nathan turned his fist, still raised, expecting the guards to assist him in breaking the lock. He demanded they fetch the master override code, barking orders as if he were still a senior venture capital partner commanding a boardroom. The head of security did not reach for a keypad. He reached into his uniform jacket and produced a thick, laminated legal folder. He held up a hand, instructing Nathan to step away from the door immediately. He stated, in a firm, unwavering tone, that the individual currently causing a disturbance was trespassing. Nathan scoffed a wild, breathless laugh escaping his throat. He pointed at the floor, insisting his name was on the deed, claiming he paid the exorbitant maintenance fees. The security chief opened the folder, reading directly from the documents Jonathan Pierce had prepared. He informed Nathan that the property was owned exclusively by a blind trust, an entity that had formally revoked all his occupancy privileges early that morning. Furthermore, the guard presented the court-ordered restraining order I had filed, highlighting the judge's signature. The mandate required Nathan to remain 500 feet away from my person and my primary residence at all times. The commotion had drawn the attention of the surrounding elite. The heavy door of the adjacent penthouse owned by a prominent hedge fund manager cracked open. A pair of judging eyes peered out, witnessing the disgraced venture capitalist being treated like a common vagrant. The humiliation washed over Nathan, draining the color from his face and replacing his fury with a cold, suffocating dread. His peers were watching his spectacular downfall in real time. The social death was swift and irreversible. The guards flanked him on both sides. They did not offer him a moment to collect himself or argue his fabricated case. They instructed him to pick up his nylon bag and step into the elevator. The fight left his body entirely. His shoulders slumped, the weight of his undeniable ruin pressing him down into the floorboards. He grabbed his bag, his knuckles bruised and bleeding from pounding on the reinforced door, and allowed himself to be marched into the steel cabin. 10 minutes later, the security team escorted him out the service exit. They pushed him onto the freezing, rain-slicked pavement of the New York streets. The heavy metal doors locked behind him with a resonant, final clang. Nathan Brooks, a man who had orchestrated a federal fraud scheme to fund a secret life and inflate his own supreme ego, stood shivering in the winter wind. He clutched his single duffel bag, the bustling city traffic roaring past him. He had no credit cards, no cash, no career, and no home. The empire he thought he ruled was a mirage, and he was finally awake to the barren wasteland of his own creation. But while the architect of the betrayal was freezing on the sidewalk, his young accomplice was busy plotting her final maneuver. Stranded, broke, and drowning in her own legal nightmares across the country, Kinsley was preparing to reach out. She thought she possessed one last piece of leverage, failing to realize her impending surrender would only tighten the noose around her own neck. 2,000 miles away from the freezing New York pavement where my former husband now wandered aimlessly, his young accomplice was discovering the brutal limitations of her own survival instincts. The crisp, oxygen-deprived altitude of the Colorado mountains is notoriously unforgiving to those without capital. Kinsley had spent her adult life pouring lattes for wealthy financiers, hating her mundane Midwestern roots, meticulously studying the habits of the elite so she could eventually infiltrate their ranks. She believed her youth and charm were a bulletproof currency, but charm cannot pay a premium resort tab, and youth cannot unfreeze a federal bank account. Booted from the opulent lobby by the same concierge staff she had belittled hours earlier, she dragged her monogrammed suitcase through the icy slush of the resort town sidewalks. Her digital wallet displayed a persistent string of error codes, rendering her incapable of purchasing even a simple cup of coffee to warm her shivering hands. Panic, raw and unfiltered, began to erode her calculated facade. The realization that she was entirely marooned in a playground for billionaires, without a single functional credit line, finally shattered her delusions of grandeur. Operating on sheer desperation, she sought refuge in the corner booth of a dingy, off-strip diner, using their complimentary wireless internet to execute one final, pathetic maneuver. I was sitting at my kitchen island, enjoying the pristine morning quiet of my reclaimed sanctuary, when my encrypted email client emitted a soft chime. I tapped the screen of my tablet, opening a message sent directly from her primary address. The subject line was a frantic, erratic string of urgent pleas. I read the text with supreme clinical detachment, observing the rapid deterioration of her confidence. The girl who had strutted through my foyer and mocked my exhaustion was now begging for a lifeline. Her message was a chaotic jumble of apologies, justifications, and ultimately, a transactional proposition. She offered to become a star witness against Nathan in the impending federal wire fraud investigation. She promised to hand over the passwords to the Delaware Shell Company, provide sworn testimony regarding his forgery techniques, and surrender all correspondence detailing how he siphoned the venture capital funds. In exchange for this supposedly invaluable insider knowledge, she demanded a single concession. She wanted me to contact the banking authorities and lift the freeze on her lifestyle brand accounts, allowing her to extract a fraction of the stolen money to fund her escape. It was the flailing, irrational bargain of a woman legally drowning. She genuinely thought she possessed leverage. She believed she held the missing pieces to a puzzle I was desperately trying to solve. She failed to realize that I had already built the entire puzzle, framed it, and handed it directly to the authorities. I took a slow sip of my herbal tea, marveling at the profound depth of her ignorance. In her frantic rush to secure a payout, she had completely forgotten the lethal paperwork she had so eagerly executed on her second day in my home. She had forgotten the heavy rose gold designer pen I gifted her, and the sweeping signatures she had provided on the domestic onboarding package. That contract was not merely an eviction waiver. It contained an ironclad non-disclosure agreement, accompanied by severe non-compete and non-disparagement clauses. By legally binding herself to my public relations firm's domestic payroll, she had explicitly agreed that any attempt to barter, expose, or leverage household information for personal gain would trigger catastrophic civil penalties. Attempting to negotiate a financial ransom using my family's crisis was a direct, actionable breach of contract. Furthermore, her desperate proposition was entirely useless to me. I did not need her testimony. I already possessed the comprehensive digital matrix mapping every stolen dollar, every forged signature, and every offshore routing number. But the most fatal flaw in her strategy was the sheer existence of the email itself. By actively admitting she knew about the fraudulent nature of the funds funneling into her lifestyle brand, and by offering to trade that knowledge for financial compensation, she was providing a written confession of her complicity in the embezzlement ring, and she was entirely oblivious to the ultimate trump card hidden in my secure server. She did not know I had intercepted her private chat logs weeks ago. I already possessed the undeniable proof of her grand extortion plot, the meticulous scheme where she planned to fake a pregnancy to blackmail the senior partners at the venture capital firm. She was attempting to bargain with the very woman who held the evidence of her premeditated blackmail. I placed my teacup on the marble counter. I did not draft a lengthy, vindictive response. I did not gloat or list the myriad ways her life was about to implode. A master tactician never wastes energy arguing with a defeated opponent. I clicked reply and typed exactly 2 words. Checkmate. Goodbye. I hit send. I then exported her frantic email, packaging it alongside the intercepted extortion chat logs and her signed non-disclosure agreement. I routed the entire devastating bundle directly to Jonathan Pierce, instructing him to forward the payload to the federal task force investigating the missing startup capital. I handed the authorities the final nail for her coffin, ensuring they had undeniable proof that she was not a naive victim, but a calculating co-conspirator who actively attempted to manipulate stolen assets. The fallout for the young mistress was swift and merciless. Without a single dollar to her name and facing mounting hotel loitering charges, she was forced to swallow the ultimate indignity. She begged a distant relative to purchase her a non-refundable ticket on a grueling cross-country commercial bus. She spent 3 agonizing days rattling over the highways, her stolen luxury luggage scraping against the grimy floorboards of rural transit terminals, moving further and further away from the glittering high society she had tried to infiltrate. She eventually retreated to the very place she had spent her entire life trying to escape. Her childhood bedroom in a quiet, dead-end Midwestern suburb. The walls of that room still featured the faded floral wallpaper of her adolescence, a suffocating reminder of the mundane reality she had sought to bypass through treachery. She sat on her narrow twin mattress, stripped of her wealthy savior, her fake corporate title, and her Manhattan fantasies. The only tangible remnant of her brief illicit ascension was the vintage navy and gold silk scarf she had brazenly taken from my closet. She clutched the delicate fabric in her hands, a hollow, worthless trophy from a war she had spectacularly lost. But the quiet of her suburban exile offered no true sanctuary. The legal machinery I had set into motion was relentless. The shadow of the justice system loomed over her modest neighborhood. Within days, federal process servers would arrive at her parents' front door carrying thick stacks of subpoenas, demanding her appearance in a wire fraud tribunal. Simultaneously, Jonathan's litigation team would file the civil suit for her brazen breach of the non-disclosure agreement, seeking damages that would eclipse her earning potential for decades. She had tried to steal a life of effortless luxury, but her arrogance had purchased a permanent, inescapable legal nightmare. She was drowning in the terrifying reality of federal scrutiny and crushing financial debt, entirely isolated in the wreckage of her own ambition. The conspirators had been systematically dismantled, their alliances cannibalized by greed and panic. The board was cleared of all hostiles. The storm had passed, leaving the atmosphere crisp and brilliantly clear. As the calendar turned, bringing a new year and a fresh horizon, the seeds of my flawless execution blossomed into an era of unprecedented personal and professional triumph, leading to a reality far beyond anything my former husband could have ever provided. Exactly 1 year has passed since the heavy mahogany doors of my Tribeca penthouse clicked shut, sealing the fate of the traitors outside my walls. The calendar turned, the seasons shifted, and the dust settling from the wreckage of their lives formed the bedrock of my pristine, unyielding reality. Today, the morning sun reflects brilliantly off the polished silver lettering affixed to the glass entry of my corner suite. Mallory Brooks, Chief Executive Officer. The transition from Vice President of Crisis Management to the head of the entire global public relations agency was a natural, seamless ascent. When the federal investigation into Nathan's venture capital firm broke, the ensuing panic threatened to destabilize a dozen major tech startups. Rumors swirled, and investor confidence plummeted. My agency stepped in to mitigate the disaster, erecting a firewall around the innocent shareholders. The executive board observed my tactical precision during the fallout. They recognized that a strategist capable of extracting her own family from a radioactive embezzlement scandal without leaving a single fingerprint was exactly the kind of leader required to steer their empire. They did not just offer me a promotion, they handed me the keys to the kingdom. I run my fingers along the edge of my bespoke mahogany desk, feeling the smooth, polished wood, savoring the profound tranquility of unbending success. This serene command extends far beyond the glass walls of my corporate headquarters. It permeates every square inch of my personal life. My Tribeca sanctuary is no longer a battleground of whispered conspiracies or hidden cameras. It is a genuine home, scrubbed clean of deception. Each evening when I press my thumb against the biometric scanner and step into the foyer, I am greeted not by the stale scent of cheap vanilla perfume, but by the crisp aroma of fresh eucalyptus and the rich, savory smells of dinner being prepared by my private chef. The sweeping corridors echo with the bright, unfiltered laughter of my 5-year-old son, Leo. He races his toy cars across the imported rugs, safe and entirely insulated from the toxic narcissism that once occupied these rooms. His education, trust the very fund his father attempted to siphon to impress a barista, has been fully restored. It was significantly augmented by the punitive damages awarded during our swift, clinical divorce proceedings. The architect of that attempted theft is currently living a reality far bleaker than any prison sentence I could have orchestrated. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation descended upon his former firm, they found the digital matrix I had compiled, waiting for them like a wrapped gift. The evidence of forged guarantor signatures and offshore wire transfers was irrefutable. Facing a mountain of indisputable proof and lacking the financial capital to retain elite defense counsel, Nathan was forced to rely on an overworked public defender. The prestigious lawyers he used to golf with refused to take his calls, treating him like a contagious disease. To avoid a lengthy federal prison term, Nathan accepted a brutal plea bargain. The judge showed zero leniency for a privileged financier who stole from his own child. The sentence stripped him of his remaining equity, levied crippling financial penalties, and saddled him with a felony conviction. In the financial sector, a fraud conviction is a permanent, indelible scarlet letter. The elite venture capital circles he once ruled slammed their doors shut forever. Stripped of his tailored suits in his corner office, Nathan was cast out of Manhattan entirely. He now resides in a cramped, drafty studio apartment in a decaying suburb across the river. But the true masterpiece of his punishment lies in his current employment. The former rainmaker, the man who used to orchestrate multi-million-dollar acquisitions over crystal glasses of scotch, now clocks in at 6:30 every morning at a failing consumer electronics store in a desolate New Jersey strip mall. He spends his days standing under harsh, flickering fluorescent lights, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting polyester polo shirt that traps the heat and sticks to his skin. The fabric chafes against his neck as he is forced to smile at impatient customers pushing extended warranties on discounted televisions and budget laptops. He answers to a store manager who is 15 years his junior. The irony is poetic and razor-sharp. The very retail chain he now serves is a company his venture capital firm used to short sell for sport, mocking their outdated business model during lavish board meetings. He is trapped in the exact economic graveyard he once profited from digging. However, the most agonizing aspect of his retail existence occurs every other Friday. When the store issues his meager bi-weekly direct deposit, Nathan never sees the full amount. During the civil litigation phase of our separation, my attorney, Jonathan Pierce, secured a maximum wage garnishment order. The mandate is automated and inescapable. The moment the funds enter Nathan's checking account, a banking algorithm intercepts the vast majority of the capital. The money is instantly rerouted, siphoned directly into a holding trust controlled exclusively by my financial planners. The funds are designated to repay the stolen assets and cover the exorbitant legal fees he forced me to incur. He works grueling, humiliating 10-hour shifts on his feet, enduring the insults of angry shoppers and the physical ache of standing on concrete floors solely to finance my weekend spa retreats and Leo's private academy tuition. He is effectively my indentured financial servant, tethered to a ledger he can never outrun. He opens his pay stub twice a month and stares at a net deposit barely large enough to cover his basic groceries, a recurring reminder of the empire he casually threw away. The conspirators who enabled his delusion shared a similar, satisfying fate. Kinsley remains exiled in her childhood bedroom, buried under the weight of civil judgments from her breach of the non-disclosure agreement. Her brief taste of high society is forever reduced to a bitter memory, and she spends her days dodging calls from aggressive debt collectors. Patricia resides in her quiet suburban tomb, her social crown fractured, silenced by the terrifying threat of a defamation suit. She haunts her empty mansion, cut off from the charity galas and country club luncheons that once gave her life meaning. They attempted to orchestrate a hostile takeover of my existence, mistaking my quiet diligence for weakness. They assumed a woman who works late to build a future for her family would be too exhausted to notice the knives hovering over her back. They failed to understand the fundamental nature of the adversary they invited into their game. True power does not roar. It does not throw tantrums in hotel lobbies, scream threats into intercom systems, or rely on cheap manipulation to secure an advantage. True power is cold, precise, and flawlessly executed. It is the ability to draw an immovable boundary, gather your resources in silence, and dismantle your enemies using the very systems they thought they controlled. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, holding a delicate porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea. The morning traffic crawls along the avenues below, a steady river of ambition flowing through the concrete canyons of New York. The city is a demanding, unforgiving arena, a place where fortunes are made and erased in the span of a single afternoon. I take a slow, deep breath, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of my own heart. I did not just survive the fire they tried to set in my sanctuary. I harnessed the heat, forged an unbreakable armor, and built an unshakable empire on the ashes of their delusion. The view from a penthouse window is deceptive. From 50 stories above the Manhattan streets, the world looks perfectly ordered, a grid of endless possibilities and untouchable wealth. But as I stand here, watching my 5-year-old son Leo push a wooden toy train across the imported rug, I know exactly how fragile that order truly is. We spend our lives building fortresses of glass and steel, pouring our salaries into trust funds and private academies, believing we are constructing a bulletproof future for our children. Yet the most devastating threats rarely attack the gates. They are invited through the front door, wearing tailored suits and familiar smiles. The wreckage left behind by my former husband taught me a profound lesson about what it actually means to raise a child in modern America. We are conditioned to believe that providing a traditional family structure and boundless financial resources equates to successful parenting. But wealth without a moral compass is just a well-funded disaster waiting to happen. In the American ethos, we chase the dream, but we are rarely taught how to defend that dream when the rot starts from within. In our fast-paced, success-driven culture, it is remarkably easy to confuse provision with presence and image with integrity. Nathan believed he was a titan, a provider who deserved to rewrite the rules of our household simply because he possessed a prestigious venture capital title. He attempted to siphon Leo's education trust to finance a hollow lifestyle brand for his 24-year-old mistress. This was not just a betrayal of our marriage, it was a fundamental failure of family responsibility. He looked at our son's future and saw only a slush fund for his own ego. It forced me to realize that long-term guidance for our children cannot be rooted in bank statements. It must be anchored in absolute honesty and unwavering fairness. True family responsibility requires us to model integrity, especially when it is difficult. It means holding ourselves and our partners to a standard of honesty that transcends mere financial provision. If we teach our children that success excuses cruelty, or that affluence grants immunity from consequence, we are not raising leaders. We are cultivating monsters. Protecting Leo meant I had to develop a hypervigilant emotional awareness, a radar attuned to the subtle toxins seeping into our home. When my mother-in-law sat in my guest suite coaching a mistress on how to alienate my son from me, she weaponized the concept of the traditional family. She twisted the sacred bond of kinship into a tool for extortion and control. Recognizing that poison required me to look past the veneer of Sunday brunches and polite society smiles. Parenting is not merely about shielding a child from the harsh realities of the outside world. It is often about having the terrifying courage to amputate the rotting branches of your own family tree. I had to ensure Leo grew up in an environment where respect was earned through actions, not demanded by bloodlines. We must cultivate an emotional awareness in our children that allows them to identify manipulation, even when it is disguised as love. They need to understand that a mother's love is not just a soft place to land, but a fiercely guarded perimeter. We often hear that we must keep the peace for the sake of the children. We are told to compromise to swallow our pride to maintain the facade of a unified home so the kids don't suffer the trauma of a broken family. But what is the true cost of that peace? If I had turned a blind eye to Nathan's infidelity and embezzlement, what lesson would Leo have absorbed? He would have learned that deception is tolerable as long as it is comfortable. Instead, by executing a flawless clinical extraction of the toxic elements in my life, I gave my son the greatest inheritance possible, a blueprint for self-respect. I wanted Leo to understand that actions possess gravity and that justice must be meticulously constructed by those who refuse to be victims. We do our children a massive disservice when we shield them from the consequences of bad behavior. Accountability is not always a gentle reprimand. Sometimes it is an empty bank account, a biometric lock, and a one-way ticket to a desolate New Jersey retail floor. The journey of reclaiming your life from the ashes of betrayal is an agonizing, solitary walk. But it is a path many of us are forced to navigate. If you have ever had to dismantle a toxic illusion to protect the people you love, or if you are currently standing in the wreckage, wondering how to rebuild your own fortress, you are not alone in this fight. I encourage you to subscribe and follow Samantha Told Stories. Here we share the raw, unvarnished truths of survival, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice in the face of profound betrayal. Share your own experiences in the comments, because every time we speak our truth, we strip another layer of power away from those who thrive in the dark. As I watch Leo sleep peacefully in his room, the steady rhythm of his breathing a stark contrast to the chaos we survived, I am left with a chilling yet liberating philosophical truth. Conventional wisdom dictates that forgiveness is the ultimate virtue, that to truly move forward, we must let go of our anger and offer grace to those who shattered our trust. Society tells us that raising a healthy child within American culture requires us to model unconditional pardon, teaching them to turn the other cheek to preserve the sanctity of the family unit. But I entirely reject that premise. There is a profound, terrifying beauty in absolute unforgiveness. Some betrayals are so fundamental, so deeply corrosive to the soul of a home, that forgiving them is not an act of healing, but an act of self-betrayal. We owe it to our children to show them that some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. We must teach them that true peace is not the absence of conflict, but the undisputed eradication of the threat. The greatest act of love I could ever offer my son was not maintaining a broken family, but ruthlessly destroying the man who tried to compromise his future. So as you look at the architecture of your own life, ask yourself, are you keeping the peace, or are you just keeping the poison? Because the people who demand your endless forgiveness are usually the ones counting on you being too weak to demand their absolute ruin.